The Madison family lived in the serene suburbs of Crestwood, the kind of neighborhood with pristine lawns, white picket fences, and a sense of calm that made it feel almost untouched by tragedy. Daniel Madison, a 42-year-old successful financial advisor, and his wife Jessica, a well-loved middle school teacher, seemed to epitomize the perfect American dream. Together with their two children, Emma, 15, and Lucas, 10, they appeared to have it all: a happy family, successful careers, and the admiration of their community. Yet beneath her seemingly perfect suburban life, something darker had been festering. Jessica had been feeling watched, unsettled for weeks, and though she tried to brush it off, the sensation of eyes following her every move grew more intense with each passing day. Her worst fears became a chilling reality, as the tragedy she had sensed all along finally struck with devastating force. On that October morning, everything changed. Daniel returned home from a weekend hunting trip with a few close friends. The house, usually filled with warmth and laughter, was disturbingly quiet. As he entered, a strange, heavy silence greeted him. The usual scent of breakfast or Jessica's voice calling out wasn't there. Unease settled in Daniel's chest. "Jess?" he called out, but the only reply was the echo of his own voice in the empty hallway. The house felt off, like a vacuum had swallowed the warmth that usually greeted him. The silence was thick, oppressive, and it sent a chill down his spine. He dropped his bag by the door and flipped on the hallway light. Still, no response. Anxiety began to build in his chest as he walked through the downstairs rooms. First the kitchen, where he expected to see the usual remnants of dinner or the faint scent of something cooking. Instead, the counters were spotless, and the air was stale, like no one had been in the room for hours. He moved into the living room, where the couch sat empty, throw blankets folded neatly, untouched. "Jess?" he tried again, his voice louder this time. Nothing. His palms began to sweat as he moved towards the staircase. The house was too quiet. Eerily so. He took the steps two at a time, his heart pounding faster with each one. A sliver of light leaked from under the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, his breath catching in his throat. Jessica lay on the bed, still, too still, her body sprawled awkwardly across the sheets. The room smelled faintly of something metallic. Blood. Daniel's breath caught as he stepped closer, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. Jessica's skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, and around her throat was a jagged, gaping wound. The dried blood that stained the once white sheets had turned a sickening dark brown, crusting against her skin and the fabric. "Jessica." His voice was barely a whisper now, as though speaking too loudly would confirm the horror of what he was seeing. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, shaking her frantically. "Jess, no, please wake up." His voice cracked, desperation taking over, but it was no yes. She was gone. His body shook as he reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice on the other end seemed far away as Daniel stammered out what had happened, struggling to find the words to explain the horror in front of him. "My wife, she's dead," he finally managed to choke out. Minutes felt like hours as he sat beside Jessica, unable to tear his eyes away from her lifeless form. The love of his life, the mother of his children, the woman he had shared everything with for over 15 years, was gone, murdered. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could this have happened? Why? Who would do this? The news of Jessica Madison's murder spread through Crestwood like wildfire. Neighbors who had always admired the Madison family for their picture-perfect life were left reeling. Jessica was more than just Daniel's wife. She was a beloved teacher at Crestwood Middle School. Her students adored her, and she had become a cornerstone of the local community. To the outside world, the Madisons seemed untouchable, immune to the kinds of tragedies that befell other families. But now, everyone was asking the same question: who could have done this and why? Detective Olivia Bennett was assigned to lead the investigation. She was known for her calm, methodical approach. With over 15 years of experience dealing with high-profile cases, Bennett had developed a reputation for her uncanny ability to read people, to see the truth beneath the surface. And something about this case felt off. As the crime scene was processed and evidence collected, Bennett focused on the details that others might overlook. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or doors. Whoever had killed Jessica hadn't needed to break in. They had either been let in or had known the house well enough to have a key. The bedroom, while a bloody mess, showed signs of a struggle, but not one that had spilled out into the hallway or other parts of the house. Jessica had been killed in her own bed, the sanctity of her personal space violated in the most brutal way possible. While the forensics team collected DNA samples, fingerprints, and blood spatter evidence, Bennett interviewed Daniel, who sat on the front steps, dazed, his hands trembling. He could barely speak, his voice thick with shock and grief. His alibi seemed airtight. He had been on a hunting trip with 3 friends, all of whom corroborated his story. He had returned home to find Jessica dead, a scene that he struggled to recount without breaking down. Bennett observed him carefully. His grief was palpable, raw, and unfiltered, but there was something else beneath the surface, an unease, a tension that made her wonder if there was more to the story. As the investigation progressed, Bennett began to dig deeper into the Madisons' personal lives. They had been married for over 15 years, had 2 beautiful children, and were well respected in their community. But behind the perfect facade, cracks were beginning to show. Jessica's best friend, Hannah, was the first to provide insight into what had been going on behind closed doors. Jessica had confided in her for months about her growing suspicions that Daniel was having an affair. He had been distant, working late more often, taking business trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. Jessica had found unexplained charges on their credit card, gifts she had never received, and once, a faint lipstick stain on one of his shirts. She hadn't confronted him directly, though. She was afraid of what she might uncover. Hannah had urged her to talk to him, to find out the truth. But Jessica had been too scared. She didn't want to destroy her family, didn't want to believe that her husband, the man she had loved for so long, could betray her. But her fear had grown into something else, an obsession. She had begun checking Daniel's phone when he wasn't looking, tracking his movements, scrutinizing his every action. As Detective Bennett listened to Hannah's account, a new picture of the Madison family began to form, one far removed from the perfect image the community knew. Behind the smiles and public displays of affection, there had been tension, mistrust, and secrets. Detective Olivia Bennett stood in the doorway of the Madisons' bedroom, carefully observing every detail. The room was a tragic contrast of comfort and violence. A warm, cozy environment, ruined by the dark, dried blood that stained the white bedsheets, the blood splatter on the headboard. The walls and even the nightstand told her that Jessica hadn't gone down without a struggle. Forensics was already at work, collecting every piece of evidence: blood, fibers, hair. Each tiny fragment could hold the key to solving this murder. Bennett had solved many cases in her career, but something about this one felt personal, almost too intimate. No forced entry, a brutal murder in the sanctity of the victim's own bed. She'd seen these clues before. They usually pointed to someone close to the victim. Bennett approached the bed cautiously, her eyes scanning the floor, the walls, and even the windows. Her instincts told her to look for something out of place, and she found it. A small, delicate bracelet half hidden under the bed. It was a thin gold chain, something dainty, too youthful to belong to Jessica. It certainly didn't match anything Jessica was known to wear. She squatted down, careful not to disturb the scene, and used a gloved hand to pick it up. "Bag this," she called over to the forensic team. They quickly placed the bracelet into evidence. And Bennett made a mental note. If it didn't belong to Jessica, someone had left it behind, and that someone could be the killer. As Bennett left the bedroom, the rest of the house felt disturbingly ordinary. Pictures of the Madison family lined the walls. The children's toys were scattered in the living room, and a few of Jessica's lesson plans were sprawled on the dining room table. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the glaring absence of life in a home that had once been full of it. Bennett headed outside, where Daniel Madison sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands, his face pale and haunted. He had been sitting there since the paramedics confirmed Jessica was dead, too stunned to move. Bennett knew she had to get a clear picture of what had happened in the hours leading up to his return, but at the same time, she needed to be sensitive. The man had just lost his wife in the most violent way possible. "Mr. Madison," Bennett said softly as she approached, "can we go over a few things? I know this is hard, but the sooner we can get your statement, the better chance we have of finding who did this." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. He nodded numbly, standing up and running a shaky hand through his hair. "Okay," he croaked. "What do you need to know?" Bennett guided him toward the kitchen table, sitting down with the notepad in front of her. She'd already taken a mental note of his initial response to discovering Jessica's body. Genuine shock, grief, horror, but there were always more layers to uncover. "Where were you this weekend?" she began, keeping her tone neutral. Daniel wiped his face, trying to collect himself. "I was on a hunting trip with a few friends," he said, his voice hoarse. "We go every year. I came back a little earlier than planned, and when I got home, I found her." His voice cracked, and Bennett paused to give him a moment before pressing on. "Your friends can corroborate this. You were with them the entire weekend." "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "We stayed at the cabin. You can check with them. They'll tell you I was there the whole time." Bennett scribbled down the names he gave her, but something about his demeanor still nagged at her. His grief was real, There was no doubt about that, but grief didn't always mean innocence. "What time did you leave the cabin to come home?" Bennett asked. "I left around noon," Daniel replied. "It's about a 2-hour drive, so I got back here around 2:30. That's when I found her." Bennett nodded. The timeline fit so far, but something was missing. The absence of forced entry still loomed large. Whoever had killed Jessica had likely known her, and the most obvious suspect in cases like these was always the spouse. But Daniel's alibi seemed airtight. She needed to dig deeper. "I know this is difficult, but did Jessica have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt her?" Daniel shook his head, his brow furrowing. "No, she was loved by everyone. I can't think of anyone who would do something like this." Bennett scribbled a few more notes, but her mind was already working. Everyone had someone in their life capable of harboring dark intentions. It was just a matter of uncovering who that person was. The next morning, the investigation continued with a deep dive into Jessica's life. But it wasn't long before Daniel Madison's name reappeared on Detective Bennett's radar. In most cases of spousal murder, the husband was usually a prime suspect. And although Daniel's alibi appeared solid, Bennett had learned not to dismiss the obvious. Bennett decided to pay a visit to Jessica's best friend, Hannah Winters. Hannah had been Jessica's confidant for years, and if anyone knew what was going on inside the Madison household, it was her. The sun was just beginning to rise when Bennett knocked on Hannah's door. A few moments later, Hannah answered, her face pale and drawn. She'd clearly heard the news and was still trying to process it. "Detective Bennett," she introduced herself. "I'm here to ask you a few questions about Jessica. I know this is a difficult time, but anything you can tell me about her life, her relationship with Daniel, might help us find who did this." Hannah nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Come in," she whispered, stepping aside to let Bennett enter. They sat in the living room, where photos of Hannah and Jessica lined the walls. The two women had been best friends since college, inseparable through the highs and lows of life. Bennett knew Hannah would have insights into the side of Jessica that Daniel might not have seen. "Did Jessica ever mention any trouble in her marriage?" Bennett asked after a few moments of silence. Hannah looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the tissue. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been suspicious of Daniel for months. She thought he was having an affair. Bennett's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an unfamiliar story. A perfect marriage hiding dark secrets. She leaned forward, her voice calm but probing. "Did she ever confront him about it?" "No," Hannah replied, shaking her head. She was too scared. She didn't want to lose him, but she couldn't ignore the signs. He was working late more often, taking trips that didn't add up, and she found things. "What kind of things?" Bennett pressed. "A few unexplained charges on their credit card. A lipstick stain on one of his shirts," Hannah said, her voice cracking. She didn't want to believe it, but I could see how much it was eating her up inside. Bennett jotted down notes furiously. Daniel Madison had secrets, and those secrets might be the key to unlocking what had really happened. "Did Jessica ever mention the name of the woman she thought he was seeing?" Bennett asked. Hannah hesitated, her brow furrowing. "There was a woman at his office, Lauren Mitchell. Jessica always thought she was too close to Daniel, but I don't know if she ever confirmed it." Bennett's pulse quickened. A name. Now she had something tangible to follow up on. "Thank you, Hannah," Bennett said, standing up. "You've been very helpful. We'll get to the bottom of this." As Bennett left, she felt the familiar thrill of the chase. There was more to this story than a simple murder. Secrets were about to come to light, and Bennett was determined to uncover every single one. Unbeknownst to Detective Bennett, Jessica's sister Lisa had taken matters into her own hands months before the murder. Like Hannah, Lisa had sensed the tension in Jessica's marriage and had grown increasingly concerned about her sister's well-being. So, she had hired a private investigator, James Foster, to look into Daniel's behavior. Foster had been tailing Daniel for weeks, documenting every suspicious move. Late-night meetings with a woman who wasn't Jessica, phone calls made in secret, trips that didn't line up with his work schedule. And most damning of all, a romantic weekend getaway with none other than Lauren Mitchell. Foster had compiled a file on Daniel's affair that was enough to blow the case wide open. But when Jessica was murdered, his investigation took a darker turn. Now, it wasn't just about infidelity. It was about murder. When Foster received the news of Jessica's death, he knew his findings were critical to solving the case. He contacted Lisa immediately, and together they decided to bring the evidence to Detective Bennett. The meeting between Foster and Bennett was tense. Bennett had been working on the case tirelessly, but she hadn't expected an outsider to have information that could potentially solve the murder. I've been following Daniel Madison for weeks, Foster began as he sat across from Bennett in her office. He's been having an affair with Lauren Mitchell. They've been seeing each other for months, maybe longer. Bennett leaned forward, her mind racing. Do you have proof? Foster slid a thick file across the desk. Photos, receipts, phone records. It's all in there. I don't think Jessica ever confronted him, but she knew, and I think Lauren saw her as an obstacle. Bennett flipped through the file, her eyes widening at the evidence. There was no doubt now. Daniel had been unfaithful, and Lauren was the other woman, but had their affair led to Jessica's death? Bennett wasn't ready to make that leap just yet. I need to speak to Lauren, Bennett said, closing the file. And Daniel, Foster nodded. I've been watching them both. Lauren's behavior has been erratic, to say the least. Bennett knew she was on the brink of something big. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there were still questions that needed answering. As Detective Olivia Bennett delved deeper into the Madison case, the investigation began to take a darker turn. Infidelity cases were not uncommon, but it was the psychological nuances of betrayal that intrigued her. Marital problems, especially those rooted in suspicion and mistrust, often planted seeds that could grow into something much more dangerous. Jessica Madison's murder wasn't just the result of a physical altercation. It was the culmination of a psychological breakdown in trust, power, and obsession. Bennett began to piece together Jessica's emotional state in the months leading up to her death. With the help of the private investigator's findings, she painted a picture of a woman tormented by doubt. The clues were all there. Late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, credit card charges that didn't align with the family's usual spending habits. But for Jessica, the pain of confronting Daniel was too much. She had chosen to remain silent, even as her suspicions grew into an all-consuming obsession. Jessica's psychological torment had likely reached its peak just before her death. The fear of losing her family, her stability, and the man she had once trusted had driven her into a corner. In cases like this, Bennett knew that the victim's emotional state often played a significant role in their vulnerability. Jessica had become trapped in her own fear, unable to act decisively or seek help beyond her closest friends. Her hesitation had made her an easy target. The investigation revealed that Jessica had kept a private journal, documenting her growing mistrust of Daniel. In her entries, she had written about her fears of confronting him, her belief that something was deeply wrong in their marriage, and her suspicions about Lauren Mitchell. The journal became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding Jessica's mental and emotional state. It illustrated a woman slowly unraveling under the weight of suspicion, trapped in a life that no longer felt like her own. Bennett studied the entries carefully. Jessica had been caught between the desire to hold on to the life she knew and the fear that it was slipping away. Her psychological struggle was one of self-preservation. But in her mind, confronting Daniel could mean the end of everything. The deeper Bennett looked, the more she understood that Jessica's inability to act had sealed her fate. She had been isolated emotionally, and Lauren Mitchell had taken advantage of that isolation. Lauren, on the other hand, represented a different side of the psychological coin. The investigation into her background revealed a troubled history of failed relationships, emotional instability, and a deep need for validation. Lauren wasn't just having an affair with Daniel. She had become obsessed with him. In her mind, Jessica was the only thing standing in the way of her happiness. This kind of obsession, rooted in jealousy and entitlement, was a common psychological driver in crimes of passion. As Bennett delved into Lauren's past, she found a pattern of manipulative behavior. Lauren had always sought out relationships that could benefit her, whether emotionally or financially. When she met Daniel, she saw him not just as a lover, but as an escape from her otherwise mediocre life. The affair had started innocently enough, but Lauren's obsession had quickly taken over. She believed that she could replace Jessica, that she could become the new Mrs. Madison. But as the months passed and Daniel refused to leave his wife, Lauren's frustration and jealousy festered. Lauren had begun to see Jessica not as a person, but as an obstacle to her desires. This dehumanization was a critical component of her psychology. In her mind, Jessica had become expendable, someone who could be removed to clear the path to her own happiness. Lauren's obsessive thinking had led her down a path of destruction, and she was willing to go to extreme lengths to achieve what she believed she deserved. Bennett's forensic psychologist provided insights into Lauren's mental state. It was clear that Lauren exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder, coupled with elements of borderline tendencies. These disorders, while not excusing her actions, explained the emotional volatility and the lengths to which she would go to secure her place in Daniel's life. Lauren's world had become entirely focused on winning Daniel, and when that seemed impossible, her mind had turned toward violence as a solution. As the investigation progressed, the psychological profiles of both Jessica and Lauren became increasingly important. Jessica had been the victim of her own fear and isolation, while Lauren had been driven by obsessive need and jealousy. The tension between these two women, though they had never directly confronted each other, had escalated to the point where murder became inevitable. Lauren had crossed the line from emotional manipulation to physical violence, and Bennett knew that understanding her psychological state was key to building a strong case against her. With the psychological profiles established, Bennett turned her attention back to the hard evidence. The private investigator's file was damning, showing clear proof of the affair and documenting Lauren's erratic behavior. But what was more compelling were the forensic findings from the crime scene. The DNA collected from the delicate bracelet found at the scene was a direct match to Lauren Mitchell. The bracelet itself had been a gift from Daniel, further solidifying her connection to both him and the crime. Forensic analysis revealed traces of Lauren's hair on Jessica's bed, indicating that she had been in close proximity to the victim during the time of the murder. But it was the bloodstain patterns that told the most chilling story. Blood spatter experts carefully analyzed the patterns on the walls and bed. Their findings indicated that Jessica had been attacked while lying down, meaning she had likely been asleep when Lauren struck. The angle of the wounds, the direction of the blood spray, all of it suggested a premeditated attack, one that had been carried out swiftly and efficiently. Lauren had planned this murder. She had entered the Madison home, likely using a key Daniel had given her, and had waited for the perfect moment to strike. The forensic team also uncovered partial fingerprints on the murder weapon, a kitchen knife taken from the Madison home. Though Lauren had attempted to wipe the knife clean, she had missed a crucial spot near the handle. The partial print was enough to place her at the scene of the crime. In addition to the physical evidence, digital forensics played a major role in the investigation. Lauren's phone records were pulled, revealing a disturbing pattern of calls and texts to Daniel in the days leading up to the murder. Her messages were increasingly desperate, demanding that Daniel leave Jessica and be with her. The final message, sent just hours before the murder, was chilling in its simplicity. "This ends tonight." Lauren had also conducted internet searches that painted a clear picture of premeditation. Her search history included phrases like, "how to clean up blood," "how to stage a crime scene," and "ways to make a death look accidental." These searches, coupled with the other evidence, solidified the theory that Lauren had planned the murder meticulously. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Bennett worked tirelessly to ensure that every aspect of the investigation was airtight. She knew that the defense would likely try to argue diminished responsibility due to Lauren's mental health issues, but the overwhelming amount of evidence against her was undeniable. Lauren's actions had been premeditated, cold, and calculated. She had stalked Jessica, waited for the right moment, and then executed her plan with precision. As Bennett prepared for the trial, she spent considerable time analyzing Daniel Madison's role in the events leading up to his wife's murder. Though he hadn't been directly involved in the crime, his actions, or inaction, had played a significant part in Jessica's death. Daniel had been caught between two women, one he had promised to love and cherish, and another who had become obsessed with him. Daniel's psychology was complex. On the surface, he was a man who had become entangled in an affair. But his failure to address the growing tension between Jessica and Lauren revealed deeper issues of control and avoidance. He had been content to let the affair continue without taking responsibility for the consequences. In his mind, he likely believed he could keep both women in his life without having to make a choice. This kind of emotional passivity had left both Jessica and Lauren in a state of limbo, fueling the psychological instability that eventually led to murder. Bennett knew that while Daniel hadn't wielded the knife that killed his wife, his choices, or lack thereof, had set the stage for the crime. His manipulation of both women, whether intentional or not, had created an environment where violence became the only way to resolve the situation. Lauren's obsessive need for control and Daniel's failure to provide clarity had driven her to eliminate Jessica, believing that doing so would force Daniel to be with her. In many ways, Daniel had been the catalyst for Lauren's descent into madness. His affair had fed into her narcissism, giving her the validation she craved. But when it became clear that he wasn't going to leave Jessica, Lauren's fragile sense of self began to crumble. The more Daniel avoided making a decision, the more desperate Lauren became. Bennett understood that Daniel's psychology was just as important to the case as Lauren's. His actions had created a power dynamic in which Lauren felt she had to take extreme measures to gain control of the situation. It was a textbook case of emotional manipulation, though Daniel likely never saw himself as the instigator. In his mind, he had likely compartmentalized the affair, believing that he could keep his personal life and his marriage separate. But in reality, he had created a volatile environment where obsession and jealousy flourished. The courtroom was a somber spectacle. a stark contrast to the media frenzy surrounding the Madison case. Lauren Mitchell sat silently at the defense table, her eyes cold and distant. She had been instructed by her legal team to show remorse, to appear contrite for the jury, but her face remained a mask of emotional detachment. It was as if she had already disconnected herself from the events that led to this moment, as if the person who had committed the crime was someone else entirely. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney with years of experience in high-profile cases, began to methodically lay out the evidence: the DNA match from the bracelet, the partial fingerprints on the knife, the chilling search history. All of it pointed directly to Lauren as the mastermind behind Jessica Madison's murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession, someone who saw Jessica as nothing more than a barrier to the life she desired. Lauren, they argued, had meticulously planned the murder and executed it with cold calculation. The digital forensic evidence was perhaps the most damning. The prosecution presented Lauren's text messages and emails to the court, reading aloud the increasingly desperate and threatening tone she had taken with Daniel in the days leading up to the murder. These messages showed a woman on the edge, someone who was losing control of the situation and was willing to take extreme measures to regain it. The final message, "This ends tonight," was the nail in the coffin. It was clear that Lauren had intended to confront Jessica, and when that confrontation occurred, it had ended in bloodshed. The defense, however, was not without its own strategy. They attempted to portray Lauren as a woman pushed to the brink by Daniel's manipulation and emotional cruelty. They argued that she had been led on, promised a life with Daniel that he never intended to give her, and that this emotional manipulation had driven her to a state of mental instability. Lauren's legal team brought in a psychologist to testify that she suffered from narcissistic personality disorder and borderline traits, disorders that could have impaired her ability to control her actions. But Detective Bennett knew that this defense would not be enough. The overwhelming evidence against Lauren, combined with her premeditated planning, painted a clear picture of a calculated murder. The psychological testimony from the defense only reinforced the image of a woman driven by her obsessive need to possess what wasn't hers. Bennett had seen this kind of behavior before. People who believed that the world owed them something and were willing to destroy anyone in their path to get it. The prosecution, in contrast, brought in their own forensic psychologist to testify to Lauren's mental state. While acknowledging her personality disorders, the prosecution's expert made it clear that Lauren had the full capacity to understand what she was doing. She had planned, executed, and attempted to cover up her crime in a manner that demonstrated a clear knowledge of right and wrong. Her obsessive tendencies did not absolve her of guilt. They only explained why she had acted in such a vicious manner. As the trial wore on, the emotional toll on Daniel became evident. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his face drawn and pale, his guilt evident in every glance he cast toward the witness stand. He had been called to testify, reluctantly, but his role in the case was unavoidable. He had to admit to the affair, to the lies he had told both Jessica and Lauren, and to the fact that his actions had contributed to the tragic events that unfolded. Daniel's testimony was gut-wrenching. He confessed to his emotional detachment from Jessica, to his selfishness in continuing the affair, and to his failure to see just how dangerous Lauren had become. The prosecution didn't need to accuse him of direct involvement in the crime. His own words condemned him enough. But as much as Daniel's testimony was painful to hear, it was also essential in establishing the motive behind Lauren's actions. She had killed Jessica because she believed it would free Daniel to be with her. In her mind, removing Jessica was the only way to get what she wanted. As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left with the daunting task of deciding Lauren's fate. They deliberated for days, weighing the arguments presented by both sides, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury returned with a unanimous verdict. Lauren Mitchell was guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lauren didn't flinch as the words were spoken. She remained eerily calm, as if she had accepted her fate long before the trial had even begun. She was led away in handcuffs, her eyes vacant, her future sealed behind the bars of a prison cell. The trial's conclusion did not bring the closure that the Madison family or the community had hoped for. The ripple effects of Jessica's murder spread far beyond the courtroom, leaving emotional devastation in its wake. Daniel Madison was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, his affair, his lies, and the role he had played in creating the environment that allowed Lauren to flourish in her obsession. He had hoped that the trial would bring some form of justice, but it only left him with a deeper sense of guilt. His children, Emma and Lucas, now had to grow up without their mother, and Daniel's relationship with them was strained, to say the least. The affair had shattered the family dynamic, and Jessica's murder had left scars that no amount of therapy or time could heal. In the months following the trial, Daniel sought counseling, hoping to find some way to atone for his mistakes. He understood that he would never be free of the guilt, but he wanted to be there for his children, to give them some semblance of normalcy in a world that had been torn apart by tragedy. But rebuilding those relationships would take time that Daniel wasn't sure he deserved. The community of Crestwood, once proud of the Madison family, now saw them in a different light. The perfect suburban image had been shattered, replaced by whispers of betrayal, murder, and scandal. Neighbors who once waved from their front yards now avoided eye contact when Daniel walked by. The house that had once been a symbol of stability and family now stood as a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Emma and Lucas, too young to fully understand the complexities of what had happened, were left to process their grief in their own ways. Emma, at 15, had been old enough to sense that something was wrong before her mother's death, but she had never imagined it would end this way. She threw herself into her studies and extracurricular activities, hoping to distract herself from the pain of her mother's absence. But no matter how hard she tried, the memories of that day, the moment she learned her mother had been murdered, would not fade. Lucas, at just 10, struggled even more. He didn't fully understand why his mother was gone, only that she wasn't coming back. He became quieter, more withdrawn, and it was clear to those around him that he was carrying a burden too heavy for someone his age. Therapy helped, but it couldn't bring back the sense of security he had lost. Jessica's sister Lisa became a surrogate mother figure to the children, moving into the Madison home to help care for them. She had been a constant in their lives, and now she was determined to make sure they grew up in a stable environment. Despite the emotional turmoil that surrounded them, Lisa's presence was a comfort to Emma and Lucas, but it was clear that the family would never be the same. The Madison case slowly faded from the public eye, but for those directly involved, the scars remained. Daniel, Lisa, Emma, and the Lucas tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of Jessica's murder would always linger. The lessons learned from this tragedy were harsh, but they were clear. Love, trust, and emotional honesty were the only things that could prevent a family from falling apart. Without them, the consequences could be deadly. Lauren Mitchell would spend the rest of her life behind bars, a prisoner not only of the legal system, but of her own mind. Her obsession had destroyed more than just the Madison family. It had destroyed her own life as well. She had believed that by eliminating Jessica, she could create a future with Daniel, but instead, she had ensured her own destruction. For Detective Bennett, the case was a reminder of the complexity of human behavior. Crimes were rarely black and white. They were often the result of deep psychological wounds, of emotions left unchecked for too long. And while justice had been served, the price had been high. Lives had been lost, families had been shattered, and in the end, no one had truly won. The Madison family would never be the same, but they would endure. In time, they would learn to live with the pain, to move forward despite the weight of the past, and in that endurance, they would find a small measure of peace. The case closed a full circle, revealing the web of betrayal, obsession, and emotional neglect that led to a tragic end. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.